Hello, MiraCosta College, summer 2020. Let's talk a little bit about the first chapter. Our book is titled The Irony of Democracy. And throughout the course, we're going to see why and what's ironic about our democracy. All right. So, in this first chapter, we're going to look at what's called the Iron Law Oligarchy. We're going to talk about elitism and pluralism. These are going to be the two theories that we are going to focus most on during this class. We're going to show how they overlap, and then we're going to try to explain what we mean by the irony of democracy. So, what is democracy? When we think of democracy, remember kind of the Aristotle type thought. Democracy is government by the people, and the responsibility of the survival of democracy within an elite system rests on the shoulders of elites. So basically, in an elite system, we have a small number of people making a decision for the greater whole, right? That's elitism. Elites are the ones that have the power. The masses are the many that who do not. Now we're starting to see a lot of protests, in June of 2020, and these masses are showing out that they can have power too. I mean, if you have a bunch of people getting together that can outnumber the elites, it's possible that government or a way of life may change. All right. Power is deciding who gets what, when, and how. And I also like to add this little caveat. Power is getting people to do something they don't want to do. All right. That's another thing. I don't want to pay taxes, right? But I do because if I don't, I get locked up. When we talk about elite theory, and that's what we're primarily going to focus on in this summer session, is elite theory is the focus on the few who have those powers, their value, their behavior, their demographics. We're going to look at elites in the judicial system. We're going to look at elitism in the presidential branch. We're going to look in the legislative branch to see how elitism works with this. All right, so remember, elites govern all societies, right? They monopolize power. They're in control. They tell us what to do, and we follow them. As a group, elites agree on the basic rules of the game, right? Now, can they change the rules of the game in the middle of the game? Absolutely, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the legislative branch. One thing are the three things that elites kind of find to be a sanctity of is individual liberty. We all are able to be free, right? Private property and limited government. Now, one of the concepts of this is we need to keep government small. And that's one of the bases of elite theory. And when we have public policy, and when we use the word public policy, we're talking about laws or acts of Congress or acts of city councils or acts of the president. These all affect us, right? Whether it's gun limitations, right now we're starting to see reforms with regards to policing. So these are all, public policies that don't necessarily affect the demands of the people, but rather the interests and the values of the elites. So in order for the elites to stay in power, it doesn't necessarily mean that masses are being exploited or repressed, only that the responsibility for mass welfare rests with the elites. The elites have to keep the masses happy or just happy enough that they don't revolt, right? So elitism assumes that we as the masses are passive, apathetic, and ill-informed. So let's go through these three words. What do we mean by passive? We don't vote. Look at our voter turnout rate. We'll talk more about that as we get into the course. Apathetic. We don't care. Who cares about all this? Who cares about, climate change? Who cares about gun control? And we're ill-informed, right? We'll look a little bit at some of the statistics where people kind of fail in, maybe basic knowledge about government. If you would take the citizenship test now, it's possible that, a lot of people might not know any answers to the citizenship test, even though we are citizens. If you are looking to become a citizen, you're probably going to be a little bit more knowledgeable about the government than some Americans, right? Elites influence masses more than the masses influence elites. So basically, we have people that can voice their concerns and can kind of influence the masses as elites. Like, Trump is a very good example of a person that has taken a segment of society and gotten them kind of fired up by some of the rhetoric that he talks, and they follow him, right? So democracy is popular participation, which we don't really have here in the United States. We have a representative form of government, which we'll get into. We have, the concept of majority rule, but we also need to respect the rights of minorities. And when we talk about minorities, we're not talking necessarily about the ethnic minorities that we have here in the US. We're talking about anybody that is affected by a public policy and is in that 49% and below category. So when we talk about majority rule, remember that means 50 plus 1, 50% plus 1. If 50% of the people plus 1 want some public policy to be enacted, majority rules, right? But there has to be respect for the minorities, and as Madison say, we need to avoid the tyranny of the majority, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So in a sense, people form kind of a social contract with the government. This comes out of John Locke's theory of classic liberalism, right? Remember, don't get this liberal title confused with liberalism now. Classic liberal theory is kind of right along the lines of what we believe as maybe somebody in the Libertarian Party now would believe in. We have those inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, which are independent of the government. And the government's purpose is going to be to protect our life, liberty, and property. That's why we consent to them. So in this social contract, we give up some rules. I mean, we give up some type of rights that we believe in order for the government to protect us, right? So if I submit to the government's rule, I have to follow the rules that they said, but in turn, they'll protect me. A good example of this is kind of when we were first put on this pandemic. Gavin Newsom, who is the governor, said he was going to rely on the social contract that we had with Californians, where they weren't going to necessarily enforce, people being outside of the quarantine, but they were going to rely on people in the social contract to kind of motivate them or to cause them to do what the government wants. Property is important because it provides economic self-sufficiency. If you have property, you could grow crops on it, you could put a factory, you could do anything you want with your property. And the only threat to individual liberty is government, and in turn, government must be limited. Government must be as small as possible. Now, when we talk about equality, equality of all people is a vital aspect of classical democracy. We all need to be equal before the law, right? Well, our vote needs to count the same, one person, one vote. And we all need to have the ability of equality of opportunity. The government has to kind of ensure that we each have the equal opportunity to be what we want to be in life, right? So remember this, you're equal in front of the law. I'm supposed to be treated the same as President Trump under the eyes of the law, right? My vote is supposed to count the same as your vote, right? And we're all supposed to have some type of equality of opportunity here in the United States. Now, the founders believed that a government rests on the consent of the governed and envisioned decisions making by the representative of the people. This is kind of where our representative democracy comes into. Representatives would use their prudence and wisdom to make decisions on what was best for the citizens or what was best for the masses. Now, do they do that? When we get into talking about interest groups, we're going to see that sometimes that doesn't happen. We're going to talk a little bit about direct democracy in another slide, so hold your thought on that. Now, we talked a little bit about representative democracy and the elites. The democratic process in the U.S. is the popular selection of political elites. We do have mass support for government, but as you can see, and this slide is a little bit outdated. This is from the textbook. What you can see here is in 1964, trust in government was about 75%. If you go down to 2014, it's right around 19-20%. This question is asking how many of people have trust in their government. And if you see that, support for government has kind of dwindled a bit. And remember, it's not necessarily a bad thing to question your government or to be skeptical of your government. In fact, that's one of the more American things here in the United States. All right, what is pluralism? Now, pluralism is another theory that we're going to talk about. Now, I'm a big Marvel fan, and I like, all the Marvel MCU movies, right? If you wanted to kind of look at an example of pluralism, pluralism is kind of where we have power in the hands of a small elite. But what these groups do is they come in together and bargain about public policy issues, right? So, like I said, Marvel Cinematic Universe. Look at Wakanda in the Black Panther movies. That scene in Wakanda where they're discussing and each of the different tribes are discussing some of the things that they want to accomplish. That is a perfect example of pluralism. As a matter of fact, when I saw that movie, it's the first thing I thought. It was pluralism, where you had each of the different tribes of Wakanda kind of getting together and discussing by compromise and bargain public policy issues, right? And pluralism basically believes that mass participation is not possible. Decisions must be made through elite interaction rather than individual participation. If we had a form of mass participation here in the United States, it probably wouldn't work due to the size. So, say for example, we wanted to pass this federal law banning chokeholds by police officers. We rely on the legislative branch to do that. We have our representatives picked to do that. But in a sense, if we tried to maybe vote on every single maybe public policy issue, it wouldn't really be possible here in the U.S. just to the sheer numbers of citizens we have here, as well as the complex voting system that we have. If you look at this is a side-by-side comparing elitism and pluralism. I'll let you guys look at that on your own time. Now, masses are vulnerable to appeals to intolerance, appeals to racial hatred, appeals to anti-intellectualism, class antagonism, anti-religious bias, and violence. We could have demagogues who are mass-oriented leaders who seek to diminish or delegitimize the system, much like what Trump did in 2016. He portrayed himself as an outsider trying to drain the swamp, right? So kind of a figure that leads people and kind of motivates people to do maybe something that they would normally like to do, like vote, all right? Now, one thing that we can see is we can see elite repression in such things as dissent, speech, assembly, strengthening of security in the name of law and order. Three words, that we've been hearing the past couple of weeks with the George Floyd protests out there. Law and order, right? How can the elites repress us? Now, if you're in San Diego here, in some cities, different cities in California, there's a curfew. So in a sense, the government's restricting our right to assemble in the name of law and order. We'll talk about this and we'll look more at these throughout the course of the summer. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the colonial experience. So we're going to right around 1770, 1775, 1776, right? We had three different types of colonies, and I'm going to want you guys to know these colonies. The first one is a royal colony, and it was a colony that was ruled by a governor that was appointed by the King of England, right? A royal colony was administered by a royal governor, and they were appointed by the British Crown. So in a sense, you got to remember these governors were going to be subservient or maybe think that they owe a duty to the governor or the sovereign crown in Great Britain. Here are some examples. I'm not going to want you guys to know exactly the states that were royal colonies. These are just some examples. Now, we also had charter colonies, and charter colonies were kind of the jumping point for our Constitution. A charter is a written document from the sovereign power of a country that bestows certain rights and privileges, right? Charter colonies were written contracts between the British king and American colonists, kind of defining the share each would have in government. So this is an example of kind of the development thought of our Constitution here. These charter colonies were a model for the U.S. Constitution, and as we can see, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are examples. Now, we also had proprietary colonies, and these were territories granted by the English crown to one or more proprietors or businesses who had full governing rights. That was a person who was granted governmental powers over a tract of land, and they would develop that land and cultivate it. Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware were all led by proprietors, leaders called governors, lord proprietors. So just remember these three examples, right? Royal colony, charter colony, and proprietary colony. Now, we had a concept of monopolistic mercantilism during this time. The Navigation Acts were a series of English laws that restricted colonial trade to England. The colonies could only trade with England at the time. At that time, there was kind of what was called salutary neglect, which was a term coined by Sir Edmund Burke, who noticed that during the 18th century, North American colonies under which were trade regulations for the colonies were laxly enforced, and imperial supervision of territorial colonies were kind of loose. So they kind of neglected the colonies during this time. Now, why did we see a revolution? All right, the British government wanted to make the colonies pay for a large share of their war debt that they had from the French and Indian War. There are taxes that were set out, right? The sugar tax, which was an act that put tax on sugar and molasses. This taxed rum, which was made in New England. It also taxed foreign goods, including wines, coffee, cambric, printed calico, timber, iron, and you could only trade with England, right? We also had the Currency Act, which regulated currency in the colonies. The Stamp Act, which was new taxes that were all required to pay on printed paper they used, whether it's ships, papers, legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, all of these were taxed. So as you can see through the taxation of the colonies, the British sovereign was trying to generate revenue. And these acts were used as revenue streams to help England recover from costs of war. Now, the Tea Act, which was passed by the Parliament on May 10, 1773, granted the British East Indian Company tea a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. So that was kind of the tipping point, right? Now we come to, kind of the Declaration of Independence. So July 4th, 1776, Jefferson wrote, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is kind of, the controversial stuff that we have, because were people all treated equal at the time? Obviously not, right? Look at the term life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is obviously derived from Locke. John Locke influenced Thomas Jefferson, and in the writings of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson used a lot of Lockean thought. Now, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, almost the same as what Locke said when he said life, liberty, and property. Let's look at that pursuit of happiness. Do you think, and this is, your own independent thought, what I want you guys to do is think about this. Why do you think they changed that from property to the pursuit of happiness? Why did Jefferson change that? I think if he would have put in property, then, we would all have been entitled to some type of property, right? Now, remember at that time, who could vote? Who could have a say in government? Rich white men with property. That's the only people that could vote and could get involved. So I think he intentionally changed that property word from Thomas Locke and changed it to the pursuit of happiness in order to make sure that, not everybody can own property. So we also had, kind of a weak governing document, and that was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation are basically a treaty between these individual colonies that established a firm league of friendship. And the federal government's main duty would be the common defense, security of the liberties, and the mutual general welfare. So the powers that the the powers that the federal government had were the power to declare war, send and receive ambassadors, make treaties, coin money, manage Native American affairs, establish a post office, borrow money, maintain a military, and so on. The states would then be able to regulate commerce and levy taxes. If we look at this last point right here, these bottom points, these regulating commerce and levying taxes, are revenue generators. So the federal government isn't really generating revenue, but the state governments are by the regulation of commerce and the levy of taxes. Some of the problems with the articles were they were weak, no executive or judicial branch. One thing you need for a strong democracy is an independent judicial branch, and we'll look more at that later. Weak state governors, no power of the central government to tax or to regulate interstate trade. Then we had Shay's Rebellion. A lot of you might remember Shay's Rebellion maybe from a high school history class. Shay's Rebellion was a series of protests in 1786 and 1787 by American farmers against state and local enforcement of tax collections and judgments for debt. So basically what would happen is if you owed taxes or if you owed money from a loan, they could potentially put you into jail, right? What happened is during Shay's Rebellion, Daniel Say's led a rebellion where they captured the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, and this scared politicians. So they felt that they needed to revise those Articles of Confederation into a whole new constitution, right? So Maryland and Virginia dealt with navigation and commerce in Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac, sought to include all states to adopt trade regulations. We had the Annapolis meeting, which 12 delegates from 5 states adopted a report outlining the defects in the Articles and called for a new kind of a constitutional convention in May of 1787. Know a little bit about George Washington. We'll talk a little bit about the founders here. They made key decisions of government, controlled the Congress, conducted the Revolutionary War, and you see the numbers here. A lot of them were educated at Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Penn, Columbia, Princeton, or in England. And a lot of them were wealthy. They held government bonds. They were land speculators. They were money lenders and investors. So as you can see, we had the formation of a new national elite. Now, founders were loyal not just to their own states, but also experienced a sense of nationalism. Excuse me. Founders believed in a strong national government with the power to exercise its will directly on the people. Okay, so that's basically chapter 1. Keep an eye out for the next set of videos for the remaining week, and we'll talk to you soon.